Hello there, YouTubes. It's good to see you again. Was the early church communist? So much no. Okay, the reason people confuse early church Christian generosity with communism is because they literally don't understand communism. Communism is not generosity for these reasons. It is a government which literally confiscates all wealth, controls the means of production, and then distributes as it believes people need, right? So the early church's version of generosity was built on the presumption of private property and giving out of your own wealth voluntarily. Now that's a really key concept. Voluntarily being generous. If you didn't pay your taxes in a communist state, what would happen to you? Who would show up at your door, and how would they enforce it? With guns, right? And so it's interesting that people think of giving money to the government so that it can be redistributed. That they think that is generosity. It's compelled. You might think, oh, but it's generous to make a system and put it in place so that there is no such thing as poor people. And the greatest irony is that whenever Marxist regimes do take power, it is terrible for poor people. So when you advocate for communism, you are not advocating for generosity. You are advocating for a political system that has empirically been shown to destroy the lives of poor people. That's not generous. You may say, no. I know the early church was communist because of the book of Acts. So let's start in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 4, verse 34. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet. And it was distributed to each as any had need. Now that sounds a lot like a Karl Marx quote, and I'll give you that. And you could say, oh, there's also parallels with monks who live in a monastic community. St. Augustine and his bros were going to live in a commune of sorts. And so you could say, no, Matt, the seeds of communism are there in Christianity. And I still continue to say, you're not understanding communism as it's advertised in the Communist Manifesto or as it's actualized in the real world. You are only comparing the early church with a fictitious utopian communism that exists only in your mind. Generosity and taxation are completely different phenomena. Now, let's zoom in on the early church in the book of Acts. Let's go to Acts chapter 5. Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back for yourself part of the proceeds of the land? While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not at your disposal? Why is it that you have contrived this deed in your heart? You have not lied to man, but to God. When Ananias heard these words, he fell down and breathed his last. And great fear came upon all who heard of it. The young man rose and wrapped him up and carried him out and buried him. After an interval of about 3 hours, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. And Peter said to her, Tell me whether you sold the land for so much. And she said, Yes, for so much. But Peter said to her, How is it that you have agreed together to test the Spirit of the Lord? Behold, the feet of those who have buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out. The early church did care about generosity to the poor. It also presumed your right to own property, and if you choose to sell it. Peter was not saying, I can't believe you didn't give us all the money. He's saying, I cannot believe you lied to us and you lied to God. It was your house to begin with. You didn't have to sell it, and even when you did sell it, you didn't have to give us any of the money. But you certainly did not have to lie to us, which you chose to do. When you affirm somebody's right to sell or not sell property, and then on top of that, you affirm their right to give or not give their money, you are in fact affirming their right to bourgeois property, which Karl Marx would not have affirmed. Here's an example of the Apostle Paul talking about wealth disparity in the early church. All right, we're in 1 Corinthians 11. I'm starting in verse 20. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat, for in eating each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in, or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. Skip down to verse 33. So then, my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that when you come together, it will not be for judgment. About the other things, I will give directions when I come. Paul is indicating here that there are some who had homes and had abundance, and there are others who did not, who were going hungry. And the ones who had homes in abundance were bringing extra food and pigging out right in front of people who didn't have any. He was not saying in a Marxist way, it should not be the case that you even have a home and more stuff than these other people. What he was saying is you are humiliating your brothers in Christ right in front of them and right in front of the community by pigging out and not sharing. So Paul is trying to get them to share, or at least to eat at home. He was not saying it should never have been the case that you had wealth disparity. He is he's condemning them for their behavior, not for wealth disparity. Let's also go to James chapter 5 to see how the early church felt about the rich. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Okay. First glance, you might think in a casual way, he seems to hate rich people. And I'm a Marxist, and so do I. I hate rich people. Therefore, James and I are kindred spirits, and he's the Lord's brother, and the Lord was probably a commie. But let's think critically about this passage. Look at verse 4. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. Then again in verse 6. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Now, like I said, think critically with me. Is James, the brother of the Lord, condemning people because they are rich or because they have wicked behavior in their wealth? Holding back wages by fraud? Condemning and murdering the righteous who cannot or don't resist you? It seems like the heart of the problem are these two things. Fraudulently holding back people's wage labor, which, by the way, I'm saying James implicitly affirms the right to have wage labor. But it was being kept back from them by fraud, and pursuing those who have no power by condemning and murdering them, and there's no one to stick up for them. So James is not condemning them because they're rich. Now, let's say he was, which he's not. You who are watching this, you who probably hate the 1%, you who say you're in the 99%, worldwide, and based on all the centuries that we've had in this planet, you are in the 1%. So if you want God to hate the 1%, you want the church to condemn people who are rich and have more than everybody else, you yourself would be in the crosshairs because you are so wealthy, you probably have no idea what it's like to not be wealthy. But good news for you and good news for me. God does not have a hateful heart towards the rich. Right here we see very strong words against somebody who's literally stealing from wage laborers by fraud and condemning and murdering innocent people. Now that you and I, God and James can all get behind. That's a serious problem. But merely having possessions is not why their hearts are fattened for a day of slaughter. All right, let's go to James chapter 2. My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothes comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down at my feet, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? You have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you, and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called? All right, in a minute, we're going to address whether or not there are, in fact, rich people who do not blaspheme the honorable name of God, and who do not drag people into court, and who do not oppress. Is that a category? And are people in that category? We'll address that in a second. But right now, what James is saying is, do not show partiality. If somebody comes into your church and they look wealthy, don't give them the best seat in the house. When a poor guy comes in, you say, just stand in the back or sit on the ground by my feet. He's saying show no partiality. Let me ask you a critical question. Why would James condemn showing partiality if in fact it was the case that we as a society should show negative partiality towards the rich? Let me ask that question more simply. If you're Marxist and you want to confiscate bourgeois property and you want the state to come in and take the wealth by confiscation of anybody who's rich or has anything more than you, then are you not in that same way violating the spirit of James chapter 2? Are you not showing partiality just in an inverted way? If James's real point here is to show equality among the brethren, why would you then endorse poor treatment for people who have more than you? That is a kind of partiality. Okay, I think that's sensible, but let's move on. Are there, in fact, people in the Bible who would be considered wealthy, or at least bourgeois wealthy, and who God does not show contempt merely because they're rich? Well, let's go to Luke chapter 7. Now when he, that's Jesus, concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum, and a certain centurion's servant, who was dear to him, was sick and ready to die. So when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving, for he loves our nation, and he has built us a synagogue. Centurions would have had a good amount of wealth and probably land. A centurion was paid well beyond what a regular soldier was paid, because they were high up. They had authority. They had a higher place, and so they got more money. And a lot of times they were given a plot of land. So when we're talking upper middle class, bourgeoisie-ish, bourgeois property, that whole thing, then if you transported Karl Marx back in time to ancient Rome and you introduced him to a centurion who had money and land, not tons and tons and tons of money like a prince, but money to pay for everything, money in addition to that to pay for things he wanted, and then on top of that, extra cash to do whatever he wanted with. Now this centurion used that extra cash to build a synagogue, so he must have been wealthy enough to be able to bankroll significant projects, meaning he's upper middle class or lower upper class, whatever that means. It doesn't matter because this is ancient Rome. But did God have contempt for this man? What did Jesus do? He had compassion on the guy, and not only that, he healed the guy's servant and commended this man's faith. And at the end of that commendation, he did not turn around and say, oh, but by the way, you're a total piece of garbage because you have a lot of money, and I hate you, even though I'm Jesus. He did not say that. Now let's go on to Acts 26. In Acts 26, we see Paul talking to a king. His name is Agrippa. You are permitted to speak for yourself, Agrippa says. So Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, especially because you are expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore I beg you to hear me patiently. Was Paul blowing hot air because he's in trouble and he needs this guy to get him out? I'll give it to you. If you're secular, you don't believe in the Bible, you just think, yeah, maybe Paul's blowing hot air. But I do believe the Bible is authoritative, and I am a Christian, and I think the Apostle Paul was not full of crap. And so I don't think he was blowing hot air. And I do think it is possible to follow in the footsteps of the Apostle Paul and to interact with rich people without loathing and hating their guts and treating them terribly. I think you can, as the Apostle Paul did, even when you are destitute, you're in prison. Paul is in chains here, or he's in custody. He doesn't have a lot of wealth, and he's in the presence of a king. And instead of saying, oh, you vile 1%, give me your stuff, he's saying, I'm so grateful to be able to talk to you so that you can hear my case. Please be patient with me. In other words, do you have the spiritual and emotional and mental maturity to be like Paul, to be in the presence of someone way wealthier than you, and then to treat them like a normal person? Do you have that capacity? Let's go to Acts chapter 10. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, Cornelius. Cornelius stared at him in fear. What is it, Lord? He asked. The angel answered, your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now, like I said, centurions were paid well beyond what a normal soldier would have been paid. Well beyond base pay. All right, so now we have another centurion. This guy would have totally triggered Karl Marx with his wealth. And yet, He did not trigger the Lord. The Lord saw his gifts to the poor and his generous attitude and his piety and commended him. Again, we have God commending a centurion of all people. Now, it's not just that centurions oppressed the Jews, but it's that this particular centurion and every other centurion would have been wealthy. Also, the main focus for early Christians seems to be the proclamation of the King of the kingdom of God, that is Jesus Christ, the descendant of David who's raised from the dead, and preaching the kingdom. The main focus of the early Christians was not creating a new society that lacked hierarchy in a secular sense, where the means of production was controlled by the state, and that they would levy, in order to accomplish their socialist utopian vision, a heavy progressive graduated income tax. These are so different. Those are not the same thing. And so their focus was entirely spiritual. And in their dealings with one another that did have to do with wealth, it was always voluntary and motivated by love, and it was person-to-person generosity. There was no middleman of the state where if you did not comply, guns would come out. Totally different. The Bible seems to have no antagonism against wage labor. Now, we saw some of that in the book of James, but there's also in Proverbs 31, the proverb honoring the righteous woman. She considers a field and buys it. Oh, with the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. Oh, that's so bourgeoisie. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. She makes linen garments and sells them. This is all within this proverb of honoring this righteous, wonderful woman, like this ideal wife. And, there's no way that you could say the Bible would be compatible with the socialist utopian vision specifically of Karl Marx, and at the same time honor and admire the behavior of such a bourgeois woman for her bourgeoisie behavior. Getting worked up. Sorry. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 says, "For even when we were with you, we would give you this command. If anyone is not willing to work, let him eat." Now, Karl Marx is attributed with a statement that you should, I'm going to butcher it, from all according to their ability, to each according to his need. Now, your need is to eat. You need to eat. You're a person and you require food. And yet, in a communist society, a Marxist one, if you weren't productive enough, you would still get your food because that's what you need. Within the Christian mindset of the early church, even if you do need food, you will not get it unless you're being productive. Which economic systems embody that mentality? Capitalism or Marxism? And you say, well, that's really harsh, especially for a Christian. The answer to the harshness of life is not a heavy graduated income tax and people with the point of a gun forcing you to give over your money so that they can redistribute it for you. The answer to the harshness of the world is generosity with what you have and even sacrificial giving. Now, it's not going to ever be enough. There's always going to be tragedy and lack, and I believe Jesus thought that. He said there will always be poor among you. But the answer is not a state that literally crushes productivity and ingenuity. I'm not an economics guy. I'm not an economics or political expert. But even somebody as ignorant as I am about these kinds of things can see from history that the states that went full Marxist destroyed their underclasses, and many millions of them died. And when you look at the European Nordic countries that institute socialist safety nets, it is because they have had so much wealth that they get to do whatever they want with it. But where did that wealth come from? Was it because 100 years ago they adopted Marxism and that's where all this money came from? Or was it that they have very successful capitalist states that on account of them being capitalist, they have all this extra money that they get to choose to be generous with? What I'm saying is, God is not saying, do radical unchecked capitalism and don't be generous to the poor. That's insane. The early church had a strong desire to take care of the poor. I want to read you something from the book of Galatians. Galatians chapter 2 says, "Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do." What I'm doing is saying that Marxism is not only immoral and unbiblical, but it's not even what you think it is. You might think it's just being really generous and sharing your Play-Doh at school. It's not. It's a government that takes everything tyrannically. You cannot confiscate all wealth and control the means of production without having totalitarian power. And totalitarian regimes have been terrible for poor people. So it's not just that Marxism is immoral and unbiblical. It's that Marxist regimes aren't even going to do and have never done what you think they're going to do. So Jesus wasn't a communist, and the early church wasn't communist. They were generous. They advocated for generosity. There's a big difference. Two more things. The Bible is not antagonistic against bourgeois property. We see in the book of Micah, chapter 4, a vision of a healthy future. And it says, "Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more, but they shall sit, every man under his vine and under his fig tree." In other words, everybody gets his own little plot of land. They get to do their thing. They get to farm and tend to their stuff and to tend to their family and be left alone. And that, you may say, is similar to the agrarian utopian Marxist vision, but at the same time, it's also an agrarian form of bourgeois property. Here's my stuff. Here's my land. I'm taking care of it. I'm not expecting you to take care of it. I get to send it under my own vine and take care of my own family and be left alone. I think I should wrap up with that. I think I've made this point clear, but I really am shocked to encounter the idea over and over and over again online that the early church or Jesus would have been communist or advocated for communism because they were nice, generous people. They were nice and generous people, and it is exactly that which makes me believe that they were probably never going to have advocated for anything Marxist. If you are advocating for Marxist states, actual Marxist states, and also understand history, then you are advocating for the destruction of a society that would literally result in the impoverishment of the poor and the deaths of many people. So I don't understand this association with Marxism and Jesus in the early church. Maybe you can educate me on this. Comment something helpful in the comment section below. If you found this helpful, like and share. Thank you for your patience in watching me rant. I'll try to focus my next videos to be shorter, but there's just so much to say. There's so much to say on this topic. Anyway, thanks for watching. So if you like this, like it. If this was helpful, share it. If you think this was mostly helpful, but there's something that you disagree with, put that in the comments below. Reach out to me. Thank you. I'll see you later.